Hey guys, welcome back. Today we will talk about the most important topic of all in miniature painting, the primary reason behind your models turning out either great or terrible. It's time to talk about highlights.
Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you're watching Balance Miniatures. This is a pretty big topic to cover, and I already have a couple of videos on some parts of it that I will reference in this one. But this time I want to give you an overview of why we have to highlight our minis to make them look good, show you the three main methods I use to do it, and finally we will talk about the colors I use to achieve them and how I select them.
So let's start by answering some of the basic questions first. What do I mean by highlighting and why do you need it? Why can't you just take a color, paint it on the model in the right place, like coloring between the lines in a coloring book, and then call it a day?
When I say highlighting, I mostly mean painting colors that are brighter than the base coat on specific parts of the model to boost the contrast and readability, to exaggerate the natural volumes of the figure, and to add details and visual interest. You could say that highlighting is simulating what natural or artificial light does on normal sized objects, but we are exaggerating it so it works on something that is as tiny as a wargaming figure.
If you are new to this, then this probably just sounds like artsy talk, so let's break it down into practical terms.
Let's say you have a model and it's all cleaned up, assembled and primed, ready to be painted. Your most likely first step is that you will base coat it with whatever colors you want. Essentially, you just paint between the lines, making sure that all the colors are in the right place and they cover everything. Here's a model after the base coating step. As you can see, it's not exactly a work of art at this point.
Some people might be happy with something like this, but if you are watching this video, you probably have higher aspirations, so let's move on.
The next step usually is to shade the model. I have a whole video dedicated to this step on the channel, so if you want to know everything about shading, check that out. It already looks much better, right? It has some depth to it that the previous step lacked. It is more pleasing to the eye because due to the shadows we created, it's easier for your brain to interpret what it sees. The previous step was flat, almost like a 2D object in a 3D space, but this one looks much more three-dimensional and it has more contrast overall, so it's more readable. But the end result of that process looks something like this. So now it's time for the highlighting step to make it look even better. I work my highlighting magic, adding all the edge highlights, volumetric highlights, extra details and effects, and at the end the result looks like this. And don't worry, I will go over what these techniques are and how to do them in a second. The difference is night and day though, right? A far cry from the original base coated model.
And there are 4 simple reasons you like highlighted models more compared to the only base coated ones.
First, because they have much higher contrast. Instead of the same color and brightness all over, they have color transitions everywhere from one color to the other, and most importantly from darker colors in the shadows to brighter ones in the highlights.
Your brain loves contrast because contrast helps it interpret depth, the shape of objects, and where one thing begins and the other ends.
Now the second but very much related reason for liking highlighted models more is that they have increased readability thanks to edge highlights. We will talk about these more later, but essentially I painted the borders of objects with brighter colors so it's easier for your brain to see where one thing ends on the model and the other begins.
This is important since minis are quite small and natural light doesn't create enough contrast for your eyes to clearly make out the details.
The third reason is that I emphasize the volumes on the model, providing a little visual illusion for your brain to understand that, for example, the leg of this Deathwing Terminator is a cylindrical 3D object that is darker on the inside in the shadows and lighter where the light hits it.
Once again, on bigger objects, natural light and shadow give enough visual cues for your eyes, but on tiny models like this, we need to trick them into understanding what they should see.
And finally, I added details and visual interest by painting in little scratches and imperfections on the light surfaces and extra effects like rust and verdigris to make your brain believe that the surfaces are more interesting and detailed than something this small has any right to be.
So let's summarize. We need to highlight our models because if you don't, your brain will interpret them as plain, two-dimensional and boring. And to do it, we need to create artificial contrast and volumes, increase readability, and add details on the plain surfaces to please the brain of the observer. Now let's take a look at the methods to achieve these things, and let's start with the most common and straightforward one first, edge highlights.
Edge highlighting is the most widely used highlighting method in mini painting and probably also the most universally hated one for some reason. Once again, I have a dedicated video about edge highlighting on the channel that a lot of people seem to find useful, so I suggest checking that out for more details, but here's the gist of it. Edge highlighting is simply painting brighter lines on the edges of all elements of the model, basically marking where one thing begins and the other ends. If you combine this with a dark line next to the brighter one, you get super high contrast and separation between the elements, which immediately checks 2 important points in our list of reasons for highlighting models: contrast and readability.
This is a super useful and important technique because no matter what other method you use to highlight your models, you will still need edge highlights to really make it look good. But if you don't do anything else other than edge highlights, this one technique will already make your models look great compared to something that doesn't have any highlights at all.
The reason why people don't like this technique is because you need to do it a lot and over again. Plus you need a certain amount of practice and brush control to do it well. But let me be very honest here, there is no way around this technique if you want to paint minis, so you better stop complaining and start learning about this and practicing it, because you will be doing it a lot. Keeping it simple, let's talk about color transitions next, or rather transitions from dark to lighter colors on the model. But let's not care about where those lighter areas should be for now, we will deal with that in the next technique. Creating a dark to light color transition on things is important because you can paint a tiny armor panel in a single homogeneous color, but in real life the same object would have a lot of different shades and tones due to environmental lights. Just look around you and check any surface. The wall next to you might be a single color at first glance, but if you pay a little more attention to it, you will realize that it might be slightly brighter where it's closer to a lamp and darker where it's farther away from it. And there might be other colors on it as well, maybe a LED light reflecting on it and adding a red cast, or the setting sun coloring a part golden yellow through the windows.
Since this kind of transition is what our eyes expect on a larger object, this is what we need to replicate on a Mini as well, but in an exaggerated way.
This means that if we have an armor panel, for example, we want it to have a brighter part usually at the top and a darker part usually at the bottom. And you can achieve this in many different ways using different techniques, each of which probably requires their own video as well. For example, you can simply create what we call a zenithal highlight with a spray can or an airbrush. I already have a dedicated video about this as well, so check that out if you want to see how it's done. Or you can use layering and glazing techniques with a brush, building up brighter and brighter colors in the highlights using glazes to smooth out the transitions. You can also use an airbrush to do the same thing much faster and better, but producing a pretty obvious airbrush look that you either like or you can mask with some brushwork.
You could even try some wet blending, but if you ask me, that technique is quite overrated and I wouldn't even bother with it as a beginner. Okay, now that we talked about creating brighter highlights on elements, it's time for the next technique which will help us place those in the right spot. Let's talk about volumetric highlights.
This one is way more complex than edge highlights because it's not only difficult to execute, but it's also something you need to understand and learn about first before you can start using it effectively. There are a lot of resources out there about this, but I find myself learning best from watching videos on the subject and then trying them out in practice. This is where this video's sponsor Skillshare comes in. Skillshare is the largest online learning community with thousands of classes led by experts across art, illustration, design, productivity, and more. Skillshare can help you take your hobbies and skills, or even side hustles in my case, to the next level. If you're searching for resources to learn about volumes and shapes or even everyone's favorite topic, color theory, then you can find a ton of material to learn from on Skillshare, so you can use it on your miniature projects later on. But we are not limited to just art and miniature related courses either. For example, I found a great course about video creation and script writing by MKBHD, one of my favorite tech YouTubers that I am in the process of watching. And I already saved some courses about photography and video editing in my classes as well, so I can improve my miniature photography and to pick up some editing tips so I can make even better videos for you guys.
If that sounds interesting to you, the first 500 people to use the link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. Get started today. It's literally a whole month of free learning, so why not give it a try? Thanks for Skillshare for sponsoring this video. I'm probably not as knowledgeable about shapes and volumes as the experts in those classes, but let me give you a quick crash course of what I mean and how to use it in mini painting specifically.
You see, every element on our miniatures, like the shoulder guards, the arms, the heads, the various armor plates, are three-dimensional objects or volumes, and they can usually be broken down into a couple of basic shapes. For example, the shoulder guard and the head are kinda like spheres, and the arms are cylinders. And if this was a normal sized figure, so like 7 feet tall in the case of a space marine, the natural light in the environment would create shadows and highlights on all of those elements, which is exactly what your brain expects to happen. But since the model is small, the volumes are simply not big enough to show the usual shading and highlighting in natural light. That is why the base coated model looks so flat and two-dimensional.
So even though the Mini is actually 3D, it's so small that we need to trick the observer's eye into believing that it's actually 3D by exaggerating the natural highlights and shadows.
Let me demonstrate this using my non-existent drawing skills. As you can see, this is a simple 2D circle, no colors, no nothing, no indication that this could be a sphere. Let's fill it in with color, so basically base coating it if you're using miniature painting terms. Now it has color, but it is still just as flat. Now let's add some shading, which is basically a color transition from brighter to darker. I'm imagining that the light is coming from above and from the left. Now we have two colors on the sphere, the base coat or mid-tone and the darker shadow color. And suddenly the circle seems like it's a sphere because it has volume. It went from 2D to more or less 3D. Now let's complete the transformation by adding a highlight. Since the light is coming from the top left from our perspective, I will add the highlight on the top left of the sphere as well, opposite to where the shadows are. And voila, we have created a highlighted volume that tricks your brain into thinking that it's looking at a 3D object rather than just a colored circle.
Now just imagine that the circle is a Space Marine shoulder pauldron or a head, and you will get a pretty good idea of what you need to do on your minis as well.
In practice, this works like this. When you start, you imagine where you want the light to come from, usually from directly above the model or from above the left or the right shoulder. Now you imagine how that light would look on the entire model and on individual elements. For example, if the light is coming from above and from one of the sides, then the top half of the model should be lighter than the bottom half, and even inside the highlighted top half, the part that is facing the light directly should be brighter as well. The tricky bit is that you should apply this both on the entire model and the individual elements. For example, the whole upper body should be lighter than the lower one, but even inside the upper body, the bottom of the torso should be still darker than the top.
This may sound either complicated or entirely logical to you, depending on how experienced you are, but knowing this and actually applying it correctly are two very different things, and how good you are at it will have a huge impact on how cool your minis will look. And once you understand the theory, the only way to get better at it is to paint some minis and then paint some more. Practice makes perfect might sound like the most commonplace thing to say in the universe, but that's because it's actually true.
Alright, let's assume that we have created beautiful volumetric highlights on our minis and we topped it off with some crisp edge highlights as well. What else can we do to make our highlights even better? Well, if you go back to our example with the wall and how it has all of those color transitions, if you look at it again, you will also notice that it has a lot of imperfections, maybe some scratches, some wear and tear, and there might even be some different colored smudges that you only see if you look real close.
In real life, very few things are perfect and smooth. Your brain expects a certain amount of imperfections, otherwise it will think that the thing you are looking at is artificial and unnatural. Essentially, our eyes want to see detail on a surface, so let's give it to them.
Instead of painting perfectly smooth transitions, we can introduce a few scratches and random marks on the surfaces we are painting. We can also add a little weathering to create even more natural looking detail, for example by adding scuff marks and damage to the surface. And if we know what kind of material we want to represent, we can use that as well to make the surface more interesting and detailed. Metal surfaces can become rusty, and the way rust accumulates is quite easy to replicate on a model. Similarly, bronze surfaces tend to have some green discoloration due to verdigris, which is another great way to make them look more interesting.
Alright, now we talked about the three main methods I use to highlight my miniatures: edge highlights, volumetric highlights, and surface detail. But there is one more thing that a lot of people find difficult about highlighting: figuring out which paints and more specifically which colors they should use for it. So let's finish by talking about this as well.
Paint selection is a pretty complex topic that probably requires several dedicated videos, but if I want to concentrate on highlighting and simplify it as much as I can, there are essentially three ways to go about it. The first way is to simply use the various systems and crutches the paint manufacturers give us. Paint ranges like Citadel and lately also Vallejo usually order their paints in groups of 3, where there is a darker version of the same color, usually with better coverage, meant for base coating, and 2 progressively lighter colors meant for highlights. For example, if you use Citadel paints, you can use Mephiston Red to base coat something and then highlight first with Evoson Scarlet and then with Wild Rider Red. The advantage of this is that you don't really have to think about it too much, you simply follow the instructions. The downside is that it leads to you always painting the exact same color progression on everything, which can become boring and repetitive. Plus, usually these colors alone don't provide you with enough contrast if you don't use anything else to enhance them. For example, you can add an orange color like Fire Dragon Bright to finish the previous red progression to get a much better contrast.
If you don't want to be dictated what paints you should use by the paint manufacturers, you can mix your own highlights by mixing in either white or yellow colors into your base coat.
Mixing in white will almost always work, and you will end up with the perfect tone since you are basically using the same paint but brighter. The problem is that mixing in the white will desaturate the colors, making everything look washed out and grey if you are not careful and don't counteract it. Using yellow instead works with some colors to brighten them up and preserve the saturation and color of the highlights, but some colors will change too much when mixed with yellow, and you can't go past a certain brightness in your highlights without resorting to whites. Finally, you can use color theory magic to mix your own highlight colors and introduce different tones and secondary highlights on your minis, play with warm and cool tones and different colored shadows, stuff like that.
This is the most fun and interesting way to do it for sure, but this requires quite a bit of practice and experimentation to get it right.
If you are new, I would look at this as a progression. Try using the pre-produced paint method first. Once you are comfortable with that, start mixing your own by adding white and yellow, and while you are doing that, you will probably try out some interesting techniques involving color theory, and you will just naturally progress into doing more complicated things. Also, I suggest watching some of my specific tutorials about techniques and color schemes on the channel. I reference all of these things in some shape and form in all of those, and you can see them in action. And if you want to see even more, then check out my Patreon. I have a ton of PDF painting guides with pictures and explanations for all of this, plus much longer video guides where you can see a lot more footage than in normal YouTube videos.
Alright, we have reached the end of this tutorial. I hope I managed to teach you something new, or at least reinforce something you already knew. If you have any questions or if you feel I left something out, please let me know in the comments. Before I sign off, I wanted to thank my Patreon members for their support. They are the ones that make this channel possible, especially the ones in the captain level. Thank you guys for watching, and see you in the next one.